I'm Joe Lex. I'm a retired emergency physician and professor of emergency medicine who lives in Philadelphia. I was born in Springfield, Illinois. The first house I remember was just 2 blocks from the entrance to Oak Ridge Cemetery on Monument Avenue. My mother was a huge admirer of Abraham Lincoln. I grew up surrounded by various pictures and statues of the great man. When I came to Philadelphia in 1986 to study emergency medicine at Thomas Jefferson University, I discovered their medical library dating back to their founding in the mid-19th century, and I found original articles written by physicians who had treated Abraham Lincoln after he was shot. I was hooked, and I became an amateur historian of presidential assassinations. This talk is one that I began developing nearly 35 years ago, but each time I give it, the information changes. I hope you enjoy this version, which I am recording in September of 2020. This is The Wound That Killed Abraham Lincoln. We'll start, as we should, with a medical history. Abraham Lincoln was 56 years old in 1865. His past medical history was significant for recurrent malaria, smallpox, frostbitten feet, lifelong constipation, scarlet fever, and severe bouts of depression. He was also for many years thought to suffer from Marfan's syndrome, a condition not described in the medical literature until 1896. However, this has since been disproven. By age 17, he had reached his adult height of 6 feet 4 inches. His weight varied from 160 to 180 pounds. His physical appearance, as described by contemporaries, included a sunken breast, spider-like legs, an intermittent squint of the left eye, and an extremely loose-jointed way of walking. Now, Lincoln had been the target of several prior assassination attempts. During the summer of 1864, a hidden gunman had fired at him as he entered the grounds of the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. In those hot summer days, this served as a summer White House. The bullet went through his trademark stovepipe hat, but Lincoln asked that no mention of it be made. He said it was probably an accident and it might worry my family. On another occasion, some poisoned castor oil had been delivered to the White House from a local pharmacy, but it tasted too bad to be swallowed, and it was discarded. There were also rumors about trunkfuls of clothing taken from yellow fever victims in Cuba and mailed to the White House. In those days before the exact cause of this dread disease was known, it was hoped that Lincoln would come down with a fatal case. This was an early example of biological warfare, similar to what the U.S. military did in sending smallpox-laden blankets to the Native Americans out west. Now, 2 years earlier, the thought of assassinating a president was unthinkable and against the rules of war. This all changed in late February, early March of 1864, when this 21-year-old Philadelphian Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren was killed during an attempted raid on Richmond. After his death, there were papers found in his pocket that seemed to indicate his mission was not only to free Union prisoners held at Libby Prison, but to burn Richmond to the ground and to capture and kill Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet. To many people, this changed the rules of the game, and assassination of a country's leader now became acceptable. To this day, it is argued whether the Dahlgren papers were forgeries. This is beyond the scope of this talk and worthy of a talk all of its own. Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren is buried next to his father, Admiral John Dahlgren, at Laurel Hill Cemetery. I am a volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill Cemetery, and I do their monthly podcast called All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Story. I talk at length about the Dahlgrens and their friendship with Abraham Lincoln in my February 2020 podcast of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories. You can find it wherever you find your podcasts. On April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln attended a play at Washington's Ford Theater at the insistence of his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. For all intents and purposes, this ended hostilities between the North and the South. But on this day, General Joseph Johnston had just received news of Lee's surrender and decided to bargain with his primary foe, William Tecumseh Sherman. Despite 2 trips to the War Department looking for telegraphs, Lincoln was unaware that this had occurred. Had he gone to the telegraph at the Willard Hotel, he probably would have encountered his friend, James Elverson, who ran the ticker there. Elverson would later be owner and editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is also buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Earlier in the day, Lincoln had met his Vice President Andrew Johnson for the first time since their inauguration several weeks before. Johnson had shown up for the inauguration drunk. General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's hero, had planned to accompany the Lincolns, but he begged off at the last minute. He said that they were going to visit their children in New Jersey, but in reality, his wife Julia detested Mary Lincoln, who had the idea that Julia was trying to steal Abraham away from her. 15 other invited guests also claimed tiredness or prior engagements. Imagine being invited to the theater by the President of the United States and saying, "No, I really can't go. I'm too tired, or I have something else planned." One of the last people they asked was their son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who had arrived in town that afternoon after his tour of duty with General Grant. Finally, Mary asked her friend Clara Harris, Major Henry Rathbone, and his stepsister and fiancée, Clara Harris, daughter of Senator Ira Harris of New York, were very late-hour substitutes. The carriage that took them to that fateful play is on exhibit in the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. There was a large crowd at Ford's Theater for the performance of the 14-year-old British play, Our American Cousin. It starred the popular British actress Miss Laura Keene, who had emigrated to the United States in the 1850s. The 38-year-old Keene was on her purported farewell tour and had acted in 5 other roles the previous 5 nights at Ford's. She had performed Our American Cousin at least 1,000 times. After the Lincoln assassination, she continued performing for several more years. Lincoln's personal bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamond, who was 6'4" and 300 pounds, the same height as Lincoln, but probably double his weight. He had been sent to Richmond, Virginia on a special mission by Lincoln. Conspiracy theorists like to say that he got drunk and abandoned his mission. That is not true. Just after the second intermission, at about 10 p.m., a 27-year-old actor, John Wilkes Booth, entered the theater for the second time that day. Earlier, while he was picking up his mail, he had heard about the presidential appearance, and he decided to carry out a plan he had been considering for months. When the Lincolns saw John Wilkes Booth in The Marble Heart at Ford's Theater on November 9, 1863, they were accompanied by several people. Among these people was Mary B. Clay, a daughter of Cassius Clay, U.S. Minister to Russia. Mary Clay reminisced about the evening as follows, quote, "In the theater, President and Mrs. Lincoln, Miss Sally Clay and I, Mr. Nicolay and Mr. Hay occupied the same box which the year after saw Mr. Lincoln slain by Booth. I do not recall the play, but Wilkes Booth played the part of villain. The box was right on the stage with a railing around it. Mr. Lincoln sat next to the rail, I next to Mrs. Lincoln, Miss Sally Clay and the other gentleman farther around. Twice Booth, in uttering disagreeable threats in the play, came very near and put his finger close to Mr. Lincoln's face. When he came a third time, I was impressed by it and said, "Mr. Lincoln, he looks as if he meant that for you." "Well," he said, "he does look pretty sharp at me, doesn't he?" This is a daguerreotype of Lincoln's second inaugural, taken just a few weeks before on March 4th. Lincoln's face itself has been smudged out by a carelessly pointed finger on the emulsion. So for many years, people had no interest in this photo. However, when people started looking more closely, there's a group of people up above Lincoln. And there, in a top hat with a stern expression on his face, is John Wilkes Booth. And in front of the podium, if you look closely, are several other conspirators later involved in the assassination attempt. Back to Ford's Theater. Booth had drilled a peephole in the door of the presidential box, and he blockaded a side door. At 10:15 p.m., during the second scene of the third act, he quietly entered the box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a .44 caliber single-shot Deringer pistol. The handgun was 5.9 inches long. It fired a ball roughly 1/2 inch in diameter from a 2.5 inch barrel. The distance was about 2 feet, although some witnesses note there were powder burns on Lincoln's scalp. Muzzle velocity was 400 feet per second. Civil War muskets had a muzzle velocity of about 1,400 feet per second. You are probably used to seeing the term Deringer as it applies to a small handgun with 2 R's. Henry Deringer, the inventor of this instrument, was a Philadelphian, and his name was spelled with 1 R. He actually spent the last couple of decades of his life in court fighting copyright because of people who had appropriated his name. The victim slumped forward in his chair. Major Rathbone leapt from his seat and moved toward the intruder, who slashed at him with a 7-inch knife blade that he had hidden in his boot. In attempting to ward off the blows, Rathbone received a wound several inches long in his left arm. The pistol, which, as you see, can easily fit into a man's hand. This was the father of concealed carry, the Deringer. In its day, it was also known as a muff pistol. It was called that because a woman could easily carry this in her muff as her hand muff as a concealed weapon. It was not a popular weapon for duels. It had very little accuracy beyond a couple of feet. It could stop someone in his tracks, however, if it was used at close range. Anyway, the pistol and the knife are on display in the museum at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Rathbone attempted to capture Booth despite his copiously bleeding wound. Booth dramatically leapt to the stage 12 feet below. He was not as good an actor as his father or his brother, but he specialized in very athletic roles, for instance, where he would make a dramatic entrance by leaping from a great height. As you can see, he was wearing his riding boots with its spurs. His horse was waiting out back. One of the spurs caught in the Treasury flag that was hanging over the front of the presidential box. Booth landed clumsily on the stage and then limped across it, startling the other actors in the play, who recognized him immediately, of course. Many members of the audience also recognized him, started checking their programs to find out whether Booth was in this play. They had not expected this. But he landed very clumsily, as I said. He actually suffered a Pott's fracture, a fracture, spiral fracture of the distal fibula with a distal tibia fracture in the landing. It's rather astonishing he was able to bear weight on this. Many witnesses reported various things that he shouted as he ran across the stage. Booth himself wrote about it in his diary. Popular history has agreed upon Sic Semper Tyrannis, the state motto of Virginia. It's also associated with the killing of Julius Caesar by Marcus Junius Brutus. Of course, John Wilkes Booth's father was Junius Brutus Booth. Interestingly, when mass murderer Timothy McVeigh was arrested in 1995, he was wearing this T-shirt, John Wilkes Booth, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Booth, brandishing his weapons, limped across the stage and went out the back door of the theater, where his horse was waiting. He rapidly escaped the city with no one in direct pursuit. In the theater, Dr. Charles Augustus Leal, a 23-year-old Army medical officer who was assigned to the theater that night, by coincidence, a student of military gunshot wounds. He was a recent med school graduate. He was in the balcony. He vaulted over several rows of seats, and he made his way to the stricken president in the presidential box. He found Lincoln sitting upright in his rocking chair, supported by Mrs. Lincoln. He put a finger on the radial artery, but felt no pulse. The victim had irregular respirations, what we would now call Cheyne-Stokes respirations. He placed Lincoln recumbent on the floor, lifted the eyelids, saw that one of the pupils was already dilated. Feeling the back of the head with his hands, he discovered the wound and digitally removed some clot, allowing blood to flow freely. Instantly, the respiratory rate improved. This is one of the Treasury flags that was over the box. It's in Pike County Historical Society in Milford, Pennsylvania. At this point, a second doctor, Charles Sabin Taft, arrived in the box. He came from the stage side. He was half scrambling up the bunting, and the actors on stage were pushing him up. Others who had arrived in the box were pulling him up. What Charles Leal did next, to me, is absolutely remarkable. This is his report in his words. I knelt on the floor with a knee on each side of the pelvis and facing him. I leaned forward and opened his mouth and introduced two extended fingers of my right hand as far back as possible, and by pressing the base of the paralyzed tongue downward and outward, opened his larynx. He is clearing the airway. I also, with my right hand, by intermittent sliding pressure under and beneath the ribs, stimulated the apex of the heart. He's doing chest compressions. I leaned forcibly forward directly over his body, thorax to thorax, face to face, and several times drew in a long breath, then forcibly breathed directly into his mouth and nostrils. He is doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The similarity to contemporary CPR is somewhat eerie, considering that this procedure would not be fully described in the medical literature until 1960, the classic JAMA article by Cohenhaven, Jude, and Knickerbocker. Now, despite the severity of the wound, Lincoln was resuscitated, and several Union troops carried him not to a hospital or back to the White House, but across the street to Peterson's boarding house, into a front bedroom that was 9.5 by 17 feet. He was laid diagonally across the bed. He was 6'4". The bed was made for people about 5'10" or less. Interestingly, earlier that month, the assassin John Wilkes Booth had visited a fellow actor who rented this room. He took a nap in this bed where Lincoln was now placed. The bed is on display at the Chicago Historical Society. The president's clothing was removed, including the greatcoat, which had been especially made for the president by Brooks Brothers in New York City. Contrary to urban legend, however, this tragedy did not prevent Brooks Brothers from making black suits for the next century. You'll sometimes see that as an urban myth. Brooks Brothers, founded in 1818, filed for bankruptcy 2 months ago, as I am recording this in September of 2020. This is the special lining of that long coat. It is absolutely gorgeous. These were the contents of Lincoln's pocket. You'll notice that the only folding money he had was a Confederate $5 bill. Now, elsewhere in Washington, Lewis Payne, also known as Lewis Powell, alias the Reverend Wood, was a compatriot of Booth. He got into the household of Secretary of State William H. Seward and attacked him with a knife. Payne was posing as a doctor's messenger. Seward's son, Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward, attempted to hold off the assailant, but Payne struck him repeatedly with a pistol, fracturing his skull. Young Seward went into a coma, from which he recovered only after several weeks. Secretary Seward had recently fractured his mandible in a fall from a horse, and he was wearing a very uncomfortable iron brace to help support his jaw. It is not shown in this lithograph. That device probably saved his life. He was stabbed in the face several times until he finally managed to throw himself onto the floor. Payne then knocked Seward's daughter unconscious with a single blow to the head, and then he stabbed a footman and the younger Seward's son, Augustus, as he was going down the stairs. As he was leaving the front door of the house with 4 bloody, unconscious victims strewn about, he buried his knife to the hilt in the chest of an unfortunate messenger from the War Department, bringing fresh war news to the Secretary of State. Screaming, "I am mad, I am mad," he ran off into the night, but he was later captured at Mary Surratt's boarding house. This picture sort of haunts me. Most of the pictures I'm showing you from 1865 show people who look like they were living in 1865. This picture of Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, to me shows a 21-year-old who could be in a Gap commercial. The knife that he used that night is in the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Now, for the rest of his life, William Seward avoided being photographed in any way that would reveal the right half of his face. He had permanent damage to the facial nerve, the right facial nerve, and lived with this permanent droop for the rest of his life. Vice President Andrew Johnson was staying at a local hotel. I assume it was the Willard Hotel, but I was not able to confirm that. He was spared. His assigned assassin, George Atzerodt, lost his nerve, went into a bar, had several drinks, and rode off in a state of confusion. I have a feeling that Atzerodt and Johnson would have gotten along together just fine, and they were both alcoholics. Other conspirators helped Booth escape and otherwise tried to spread chaos throughout the city. Eventually, 8 of them were tried, and 1 escaped. Mary Surratt was found guilty of harboring these assassination conspirators. Her boarding house is now a Chinese restaurant in Washington, although it does have a very nice plaque on the outside wall. In the meantime, the Surgeon General Joseph Barnes was summoned, and he assumed care of the president along with Dr. Taft, and Charles King Stone, the Lincoln family doctor. Dr. Taft's account was published in the Philadelphia Medical and Surgical Reporter on April 22, 1865. This is one of those documents that I spoke of earlier that I discovered in the Thomas Jefferson Medical School library. The wound was examined, the finger used as a probe, and the ball found to have passed beyond the reach of the finger into the brain. The respiration became labored, pulse 44, feeble, eyes entirely closed, the left pupil much contracted, the right widely dilated, total insensibility to light in both. The left upper lid was swollen and dark from effused blood, great protrusion of the eye. End quote. Another quote, about 11:30 p.m., twitching of the facial muscles of the left side, and the mouth was drawn to the same side. He's starting to have focal motor seizures. At 1 a.m., there were spasmodic contractions of muscles, pronation of both forearms, both pupils widely dilated. The president is posturing. He is essentially brain dead. His brain has herniated. Another quote, it was remarkable to observe the great difference in character of the pulse whenever the orifice of the wound was freed from coagulum and discharged freely, thus relieving in a measure the compression. End quote. Here is Taft explaining the Cushing phenomenon 30 years before Harvey Cushing described it, with increased intracranial pressure and the effect on the vital signs. Taft then describes wound exploration with two different probes, one of which was passed more than 5 inches along the bullet path until it struck fragments of the orbital plates. It does not appear they used a Nelaton probe. A Nelaton has an unglazed porcelain ball tip. If you touch bone with it, it leaves no mark. If you touch a bullet, there would be a trace of lead on the ball. There is the lead bullet. After cessation of bleeding from the wound, the respiration was stertorous up to the last breath, which was drawn at 21 minutes and 55 seconds past 7. The heart did not cease to beat until 22 minutes and 10 seconds past 7. Cause of death was brainstem herniation, leading to respiratory and cardiac arrest. Individuals in the room when he died, including his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, Senator Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was the senator who was beaten into unconsciousness during the abolition debates on the floor of the Senate many years before. He actually came to Philadelphia to recover in the home of Reverend William Henry Furness, who is buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, of course. Also, Generals Henry Wager Halleck, Richard James Oglesby, and Montgomery C. Meigs, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. 3 of the men may have been having second thoughts about their refusal to an invitation to the theater earlier in the evening. This is a fairly decent representation of the room at the Petersons boarding house. It gets the size right, it gets the scales right, it even gets the pink flocked striped wallpaper right. This lithograph, on the other hand, shows an incomprehensible 44 people in the room, which, remember, was 9.5 by 17 feet, roughly 162 square feet. This is why some things about the Lincoln assassination are confusing when you see illustrations like this. Peterson Boarding House is now a National Historic Landmark, which you can visit. This plaque is on the front. This is the room. You'll notice the bed is faced in the other direction. I did not take a picture of the head of the bed. There is a plexiglass covering of one of the pillows that was used when Lincoln was dying in this bed. There is a blood-soaked pillow in this room. And you'll notice there is a plaque over on the dresser. Dr. Stone obtained permission for autopsy. At about noon, some 5 hours after death, the postmortem examination was made in the guest bedroom at the White House, what we now call the Lincoln Room. Assistant Surgeon General J. Janvier Woodward and Captain Edward Curtis did the actual autopsy. Their official report gave the track followed by the lethal ball. The ball entered the skull through the occipital bone, about 1 inch to the left of the median line and just above the left lateral sinus. It then penetrated the dura mater, passed through the left posterior lobe of the cerebrum, entered the left lateral ventricle, and lodged in the white matter of the brain just above the anterior portion of the left corpus striatum, where it was found. The brain around the tract was pultaceous. That's a good word. We should use that more frequently in medicine. Pultaceous means pudding-like. Anyway, the brain around the tract was pultaceous and livid from capillary hemorrhage into its substance. The ventricles of the brain were full of clotted blood. A thick clot beneath the dura mater coated the right cerebral lobe. So all of the description of damage to the brain is on the left, but there is a subdural hemorrhage or a subdural hematoma on the right. Now, just as 98 years later there would be controversy over another presidential autopsy, many discrepancies exist in eyewitness reports. The primary pathologist, Dr. Woodward, stated the bullet lodged in the left side of the brain. At least 2 other witnesses to the autopsy say the bullet crossed the midline and lodged in the right cerebrum. Dr. Taft and Leal also vary on which pupil was constricted and which was dilated. This is understandable. I have made this mistake myself. If you are standing at the head of the bed looking at somebody's pupils, their right is your right, their left is your left. If, on the other hand, you are down towards the foot of the bed and looking up, you have to switch these things in your mind. I am sure that more than once I made this mistake and said that the wrong pupil was dilated and the wrong pupil was constricted. Artifacts from the Lincoln assassination, including the fatal bullet, bone fragments, and the probe used during the autopsy, are housed at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Springs, Maryland. These are some bone fragments. This is the bullet itself. This used to be housed at Walter Reed Hospital. It was called the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology Museum. And the first time I saw it back in the mid-1960s, it was actually on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It was one of the most fascinating buildings I have ever been in. Each time it has been moved now, the collection shrinks. What is shown, the collection actually shrinks. And just another representation of that Deringer. Could Lincoln have been saved using modern neurosurgical techniques, blood transfusions, antimicrobial therapy? This was a large projectile. It was 44 caliber, roughly 1/2 inch in diameter. It was fired at a distance less than 24 inches, short-barreled 2.5 inch Deringer pistol with a rifled barrel, caused a 1-inch diameter plug of bone to penetrate the lateral venous sinus, the meninges, and brain matter to a depth of 3 inches. There was a fragment of metal the size of a modern dime torn off and deflected, but the bulk of the projectile traveled 7.5 inches through the brain to lodge in the anterior cerebrum. In addition, the wound was probed twice with unsterile fingers, twice more with unsterile metal probes. Add to this the scattering of the victim's thick hair through the wound tract, and the probability of infection is quite high, even in these modern days of surgical debridement and antibiotics. The Army surgeons who attended the stricken president expressed surprise that he survived as long as he did. Dr. Taft wrote, quote, "It was the opinion of the surgeons in attendance that most patients would have died in 2 hours from the reception of such an injury," end quote. What if this had happened in 2020? Lincoln would have been transported either by ground or helicopter to the closest Level 1 trauma center. In this case, probably the Ronald Reagan Trauma Center at George Washington University. A team of specially trained, board-certified emergency physicians, trauma surgeons, and neurosurgeons would have either been waiting or readily on call. His airway would have been secured by the emergency physician or an anesthesiologist, while nurses started intravenous lines, inserted an indwelling bladder catheter, attached him to a cardiac monitor, pulse oximeter. Technicians would have cut off his clothing and his boots with trauma shears, and the trauma surgeon would have done a thorough head-to-toe examination to be assured that there were no other injuries. If his blood pressure were unstable, he would have received a bolus of fluid and perhaps uncross-matched blood. Because of the dilated pupil, he may have been hyperventilated to temporarily reduce intracranial pressure and possibly received hypertonic IV solutions, mannitol or hypertonic saline. At some point, he would have received a tetanus booster and a dose of antibiotics. And when his vital signs were stabilized, he would have been taken to the CT scanner to see the extent of damage. As it became apparent that this was an isolated head injury, the neurosurgeon would have assumed primary care of the patient and taken him to the operating room for craniotomy, wound care, and debridement. With contemporary treatment, Lincoln probably would have had about a 50% chance of survival, although he would have been far from normal. In contemporary times, we have seen other high-profile people with apparently similar injuries survive and even thrive. Ronald Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, had a wound that crossed the midline, and under 1981 standards would have almost certainly been lethal, but he survived for another 33 years. Here he is in 2006. He became an advocate for gun safety and control along the way. Arizona's representative to the 8th Congressional District, Gabby Giffords, was shot in the head with a 9mm pistol during an assassination attempt in 2011. Hers was a transcranial wound from front to back. She also has survived. She has also become an advocate for anti-gun violence causes. Many other physicians have weighed in on this and felt that there was a good chance that Lincoln would have survived had he been treated in current times with current medical techniques. John Wilkes Booth, the central figure in the assassination, was positively identified immediately. He was one of the best-known actors in the country. His assassination would be the equivalent of Timothy Chalamet shooting Donald Trump or Harry Styles shooting Boris Johnson. Reward post, if you don't know who they are, ask your grandkids. They will know. Reward posters were set up along his presumed escape to the south. You will notice that Surratt is mentioned. Surratt was not even in country, and Davy Harold's last name is spelled wrong. His last name was Herold. Booth's first stop was at the Surratt Tavern in Prince George's County, Maryland. He picked up a revolver and ammunition that he had stored there earlier. You can go on an assassination tour. There are a couple of companies that will do this, give you an assassination vacation and follow the route that Booth took towards his final destiny. Then he headed to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd near Waldorf, Maryland. He got treatment for his broken ankle, state-of-the-art care in those pre-plaster and pre-X-ray and pre-fiberglass days. I should have pointed out earlier that that X-ray I showed you of a Potts fracture obviously was not John Wilkes Booth, since the X-ray wasn't invented until 30 years later. After receiving a splint in crutches, Booth and Davy Harold headed further south, seeking shelter. And yes, Dr. Mudd was very much involved in this. This is a plaque outside the door. There's a sign on the door that says no photos inside. I followed their instructions. It's, their house, their rules. So I do tend to not take photos where there is a sign that says that. There was a pair of boots under the bed, however, and I don't remember whether they were John Wilkes Booth's boots that had been cut off him or whether they were a replica pair of boots. This is their route south. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton assumed the mantle of leadership after Lincoln's death. The Constitution did not yet provide for an orderly succession of power. By tradition, this job had in two prior instances gone to the vice president. Stanton was a staunch conservative, and he was later implicated by many in an assassination conspiracy. I personally believe that Stanton loved Lincoln too much to have anything to do with his death. On April 26, 1865, Booth and co-conspirator Davy Harold were located in a tobacco barn at Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia, about 60 miles from the scene of the crime. With the barn surrounded, Harold surrendered. Booth stood fast. Lieutenant Edward Doherty, the leader of the detail, ordered the barn set afire. Booth hobbled close to the door on his makeshift crutch. Perhaps he was looking for a clear shot at his tormentors. At any rate, from here the details are sketchy. A shot rang out. Booth fell to the ground, mortally wounded by a bullet in his neck. He was instantly quadriplegic and died a few hours later. I used to use this lithograph of Booth being carefully extricated from the burning barn with C-spine precautions. Whether Booth was actually the man shot was yet another conspiracy theory for many years. The house no longer stands. This was a favorite attraction at Southern carnivals during the first half of the century. The mummy, advertised as the body of John Wilkes Booth. This rumor said that he had escaped his pursuers and died a natural death in the early 1900s. There was yet another conspiracy theory that Lincoln himself survived the assassination and moved to Texas and became a farmer and lived out his days there and died in the 1890s. No, John Wilkes Booth was positively identified by family members, by his facial features, by a tattoo, and by several other features. He is actually buried in the family plot in Baltimore at Greenmount Cemetery. This is a large plot. Several of the members of the family have their own individual stones in addition to this obelisk. If you take a tour of Greenmount Cemetery, the guide will point to a spot where they say, we think John Wilkes Booth is buried there. We're not sure. He did not receive his own stone for fear that his body would be dug up. He is actually not buried far from Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin, co-conspirators. Not all of Booth is in Baltimore. His spine, shown here, is on display at the National Museum of Medicine and Health in Silver Springs, Maryland. Part of his thorax is here in Philadelphia at the Mutter Museum. Now, this photo also shows James Garfield's spine, T12L1L2. It is now on display. Many years ago, when I visited this museum when it was at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, I spoke to one of the docents, and I mentioned that I was a student of presidential assassinations. He said, "Well, I have something that you might like to see." And he took me to the storage area. If you've seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they are taking, at the end of the film, they are taking the Ark of the Covenant to be stored in a massive warehouse. I swear that was filmed in the Army Institute of Pathology Museum warehouse. We walked down several rows, we went down an aisle, and the docent reached for a Tom McCann shoebox on a shelf, opened it, and handed me Garfield's spine. For about 30 seconds, I actually got to hold it. As I say, it is now on display at the new museum. Now, who shot Booth? Credit was claimed by this guy, Thomas P. Corbett, a religious fanatic who was assigned to the detail only days before. He defied direct orders from Stanton and from Doherty, both of whom said Booth will be taken alive. Corbett's explanation was, "Providence directed me." Thomas H. Corbett was born in London in 1834. He came to the United States at an early age. His wife and infant son died in childbirth, and he became an alcoholic. He took to drink and travel. He plied his trade as a hatter. What happened to hatters in the 19th century? They were exposed to mercury fumes. They developed a particular type of dementia, if you remember the Mad Hatter from Lewis Carroll's stories. One night in Boston, during a drunken binge, he was converted by a street preacher, and he was rebaptized Boston Corbett in honor of the city in which he was saved. Corbett earned his own place in medical lore on July 16, 1858. Two prostitutes approached him and tried to lead him astray from his righteous path. He was admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital a few hours later. This is his admission note. Quote, "Is a Methodist, and having perused the 18th and 19th chapters of Matthew, he took a pair of scissors and made an opening 1 inch long in the lower part of the scrotum. He then drew down the testes and cut them off. He then went to a prayer meeting, walked about some, and ate a hearty dinner. There was not much external hemorrhage, but a clot had filled the opening so that the blood was confined in the scrotum, which was swelled enormously and was black. He called on Dr. Hodges, who laid it open and removed the blood. He tied the cord and sent him here." In 1886, Corbett somehow obtained a job as doorkeeper at the Kansas State Legislature. One day he strode onto the floor of the House as it was in session, and he opened fire on the lawmakers. He injured no one in the terrified crowd, but for this he was placed in the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. He escaped a few months later, disappeared somewhere in the South, and was never heard from again. Conspirators Lewis Payne, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, and Davy Harold were tried and convicted by a military tribunal and hanged by the necks until dead on July 7, 1865, at the Washington Arsenal. This is now Fort Leslie McNair. It was renamed after World War II. One of the people standing on the wall behind this scaffold is the Zelig of the Civil War, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Hero of Gettysburg, wounded at Chambersburg, he was present at Appomattox, recipient of the Medal of Honor many years later. He was later president of Bowdoin College in Maine and governor of Maine. Other conspirators found guilty of only aiding and abetting Booth's getaway or plotting to kidnap the president received lighter sentences, and President Andrew Johnson pardoned several of them a few years later. You will notice they were kind to Mary Surratt on the far left. They wrapped her skirt so that when she fell through the trap door, it did not fly up and expose her legs. Mary Surratt was the first woman executed by the government of the United States. They were buried temporarily, very close to the gallows at the Washington Arsenal. That wall no longer exists. After 3 or 4 years, the bodies were released to family members and reburied. If you visit that site today, there is a tennis court. Off to the left in the third floor is the courtroom where the military tribunal occurred. This is open for the public to tour. If you are interested in the assassination, it's a great place to visit. Lewis Powell was buried in the family plot in Seminole County, Florida, except for his head. His head was actually at the Smithsonian for more than a century. It was only rediscovered a few years ago, mixed with a group of Native American heads when the Smithsonian decided it was time to repatriate them to their sacred grounds. Somehow Powell's skull had gotten mixed with theirs, and it was buried with the rest of his body less than 20 years ago now. Mrs. Surratt is buried in Washington, D.C. So is George Atzerodt, but his grave is unmarked. We're not sure exactly where he is in the Glenwood Cemetery. Davy Harold is also buried in Washington, D.C. at Congressional Cemetery. And then when Samuel Mudd died several years later, he was buried in Bryantown, Maryland. John Surratt, this is Mary Surratt's son. He was in Canada at the time of the assassination. He eventually made his way to Rome. He joined the Swiss Zouaves and became a papal guard for Pope Pius IX. He used the name John Watson. While he was traveling to Egypt in 1866, he was captured and extradited back to the United States. 18 months after his mother was hanged, Surratt was tried in a civilian court in the state of Maryland, not before a military tribunal, as his mother and the others had been. There was a recent Supreme Court decision, Ex parte Milligan, that declared the trial of civilians before military tribunals was unconstitutional. After 2 months of testimony, Surratt was released because of a mistrial. 8 jurors had voted not guilty, 4 voted guilty. The statute of limitations on charges other than murder had run out, and Surratt was released on bail. He is buried in Baltimore. This is a photo I took at the Surratt Tavern during a tour several years ago. Lincoln's body began a 2-week journey, 1,600 miles through 400 cities and towns through the Northeast on its way home to Springfield, Illinois. The funeral procession was the largest in the United States since the one 8 years before for polar explorer Elijah Kent Kane, as his body moved from New Orleans to Philadelphia. Elijah Kent Kane is interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery. The engine was one of several which made the trip. The funeral car itself was purchased by Lincoln's old bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamond. While the body was on display in New York City, a photograph was secretly made of Lincoln in his coffin. It was seized by Edwin Stanton and only rediscovered in 1952. This is the way it looks with a little bit of computerized enhancement. Most Americans saw only lithographs of the catafalque as were published in magazines of the day, Harper's, Atlantic, Godey's Ladies' Journal, etc. Now, there are lots of photos of the funeral procession as it made its way through various American cities. This is my favorite. It was taken in New York as the procession wound down Broadway. The building on the left is the Roosevelt Mansion. Look in the upstairs window. There are 2 little boys watching the parade. They are future President Theodore Roosevelt and his brother Elliott Roosevelt, future father of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. When Roosevelt was sworn in as president in 1905, he was wearing a ring which contains strands of Lincoln's hair. This is the funeral coach, a photo of the funeral coach that carried Lincoln from the train station to the cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. His funeral oration in Springfield was delivered by this man, Bishop Matthew Simpson. He's not buried at Laurel Hill. He is buried at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Lincoln's final resting place is at the end of Monument Avenue at Oak Ridge Cemetery, Springfield, Illinois. In this illustration, you can see the funeral cart as I discussed before. Initially, he was buried in this hillside mausoleum, but his body was almost kidnapped and held for ransom in 1876, so a secure tomb was built inside a monument. The body of President Abraham Lincoln was moved throughout Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield an incredible 17 times and viewed 6 before finally resting. Due to security and reconstruction issues of the tomb, President Lincoln spent decades of literal upheaval before his body was placed in the final tomb on September 26, 1901, 36 years after his death on April 16, 1865. Prior to being reburied, his coffin was opened to be certain that his body was still there one last time. One of the witnesses to this event was my father's father's father, Adam Lex, a German immigrant who had come to the United States in 1879 and took a job as a gravedigger at Oak Ridge Cemetery. He was from Heidelberg, Germany, not Heidelberg, but Heidelberg. Lincoln was once again identified, this last time, and his coffin was sunk into several feet of concrete and then covered with this massive marble stone to prevent further possible desecration. If you visit the cemetery and the tomb, make sure you rub Lincoln's nose for good luck. This Gutzon Borglund sculpture of Abraham Lincoln has been a good luck charm for decades. I remember in the early 50s being held up so I could rub the nose. Remember Major Rathbone, the Army officer who was stabbed by Booth in Lincoln's theater box. He married his stepsister Clara, and they had 2 children, but he did not live happily ever after. Rathbone was haunted by the thought that he could have acted more quickly and saved Lincoln. He suffered from chronic headaches, worsening delusions, and depression. During an 1883 trip to Germany, the major gave in to his delusions. He shot his wife Clara in the back of the head, just like Lincoln had been shot, and then he sliced himself with a knife, attempting to duplicate the wounds caused 18 years before by Booth. He was committed to a German asylum, where he died in 1911, and he was buried next to Clara in the city cemetery at Hanover. As time passed, the cemetery management looked over the records concerning plots without recent activity or family interest. They decided in 1952 that Rathbone's and Clara's remains were unclaimed. They were both disinterred, and their remains were disposed of. Harry and Clara's son, Henry Riggs Rathbone, was born February 12, 1870, on what would have been Lincoln's 61st birthday. He grew up to be a congressman from Illinois, whose primary contribution to history was pushing through legislation to make Ford's Theater a National Historic Site and part of the National Park Service. The Lincoln funeral car was the last destroyed by fire in 1951. I invite you to listen to the podcast I do for Laurel Hill Cemetery and West Laurel Hill Cemetery. You will find stories about Ulrich Dahlgren, Henry Deringer, and Bishop Matthew Simpson in various podcasts that I have done. You can find them wherever you find your podcasts. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Stay safe. Stay well. There's my email address if you want to get in touch with me. And Lord knows, if you want to give me a call, there is my phone number. Thanks again for listening.